Hello, dear audience. We are going to continue our conversation on the topic that we started last time on vanity. I would like to share the expression from the Ecclesiastes, from one of the books in the Old Testament, written most likely by King Solomon. He says, "Vanity, vanity, all is vain." We have many values. We are attached to many things in our lives, and they mean something to us. But in the end of his life, King Solomon probably had more than any of us can ever, maybe combined all together, have. And yet he finds out that it's all empty. One of the descriptions of the word vanity or vain means empty. So he reached for many values, and he ended up with nothing at the end of his life. But I guess he gained the knowledge of knowing that everything else in the life, all physical goods or values that he had gained, were empty. And when we reach to that point, I guess that's where we find the real value. Thank you, Presbytera, for being with us for this second conversation on vanity. We obviously cannot speak about all aspects of vanity, how it reveals in us, in our lives, because sometimes it can come unnoticed as a thief. And one day we'll figure out that we already have it, and we are prisoned in this small cell of vanity, and we cannot get out of it unless we have something else to come and help us. Maybe we should talk about emptiness of vanity.
I think you described it very well, that in the end, vanity is empty. Why? Because the God that it is serving, the gospel it preaches, doesn't exist. It's a distraction, a major distraction that builds on itself and can, like a runaway locomotive, take us in a direction we never ever intended, or especially God never intended for us. And so it's always important to keep a mind on what we're doing frequently, how to be right-sized in the presence of God. Right-sized in the presence of God is, for me, a way of referring to humility. And try to keep discerning between the difference of healthy self-care so that we can comport and present ourselves with self-respect, which as temples of the Holy Spirit, our bodies are holy, created by God, and so how do we, in the context in which we find ourselves, address that God's given us many opportunities and gifts and has placed us in life where there may be many gifts that we need to be more appreciative of, and so to pay attention to our own lives in a way that respects these gifts. That's not vanity, that's called healthy self-care. And healthy self-care makes us more able to share what we've been given with others. When we fall into vanity, however, all of these gifts take on a life of their own, and we try to keep feeding those expectations of strength, vigor, beauty, abilities, popularity. All of these can take a life of their own in such a way as to turn us into a caricature of who we could have been. That's what's really sad. I had a memory coming up driving here from the Cape of speaking to a community north of Boston, a Greek Orthodox community. If I remember, it was back in the 80s. It was a presentation, on the Orthodox mindset, on phronema, the Orthodox way of seeing and being in the world. It was sponsored by the ladies group of that community. Most ladies groups in many of our parishes are very well organized. They are run by the women that are the pillars of the community. Many of them are very popular or wealthy or have a kind of prestige within the local civil community as well as the religious community. And I remember being ushered into the church to speak to this group. And we're talking about the Christian mindset, the Orthodox Christian mindset, that's very specific, at least from an Eastern Christian perspective. And they were very kind. They made a big deal about me coming, and they had a banquet, and they had a dais, and the whole sort of preparation. But when I was being ushered in, there was a little old lady in the corner of the narthex of the church. And when I say little old lady, she was dressed in black, she was hunched over, she looked like she was destitute. And I'm embarrassed to say she had lots of hairs growing out of her chin, and they were not pretty, they were pretty long. And so she wasn't taking care of herself. And my heart went out to her. I don't know why, and she noticed me, and our eyes connected a few times. And I would ask the ladies, these beautifully dressed, these wonderfully attentive, successful, powerful ladies, who's she? And it's, oh, never mind her. We have her watching the candles. And I remember asking a couple of times, what about that little lady? Can she join us? And every time I tried to make an effort it was very difficult to even be heard. Every time I made an effort to try to bring this lady in to the room, just to she didn't sit at the table where the meal was being set.
Poor Lazarus.
Well, a lot, What's interesting, the whole culture of this group that had invited me had kind of like defined that she was of no consequence. And anytime I tried to notice her, it wasn't kind of like Mother Teresa trying to change the culture in India. It was like trying to change this culture in the room, now that I look 20 years later. And they wouldn't budge. And then I gave my presentation on the Christian mindset, leaving with a sick feeling in my stomach that this lady was left unattended to. And so in hindsight now, 20, 25 years later, it was the vanity that was ruling this group, that had them high on themselves. Look how great we are, we're doing a wonderful thing. And it was a wonderfully organized thing. But they didn't make room for the least among them. And this is what vanity does. It blocks our heart from seeing those who are least among us, who are one of us. And what does Jesus say? What we do to the least of our brothers and sisters before us, we do to him. So what do we do to the Lord that day as a result of our vanity? Trying to improve?
He was waiting outside of the door. We're talking about his teachings, and we didn't let him go into the room to hear it.
I'm embarrassed.
Well, you tried, and she was noticing that you're trying. And he was noticing too.
Well, at least I'm still trying.
Yes.
20 years later, I'm still trying a little bit.
It reminds me of the story from the Diaries of a Country Priest,
Okay.
a young man who has been assigned to this remote village. And he's so young, he just came out of the seminary, maybe 18, 19 years old. Doesn't have any experience, doesn't have anything to offer to these people except some book knowledge. And one of the villagers in a conversation mentions that he envies this priest because of his prayer life. And the priest is very surprised. He's like, what are you talking about? I cannot pray. I try and try and try and try and try again. It never works. I cannot have a prayer life. And the villager says, that's what I envy, your persistence. And what I wanted to refer here is, first of all, I would like to know what the church fathers speak about this. Because in the modern society, that's a very negative aspect of life, of Christian life. What does the church teach about vanity? Like I mentioned in the first conversation, it's one of the deadly sins. How is it so? And what does the church teach? If we go to church, what we will learn about vanity?
There's so many friends we probably both know who may or may not remain in the Christian church for sincere reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And my prayer is that their sincerity will lead them to deeper levels of encounter with the Lord himself. And so if right now he may be, or she may be, any friends that we may have that are searching outside Christian domain, so to speak, that their sincerity will paradoxically bring them back to the Lord of life himself. Having said that, that's one point. You were asking also stories that might come to my mind that I've studied regarding the church fathers. And the one that comes to my mind, and you mentioned Ecclesiastes earlier about vanity, all is vanity. St. John Chrysostom, the patriarch of Constantinople in the 4th century, often would give sermons based on this passage, confronting the leadership of his time as being basically people who are intoxicated with their own beauty and their own selves, and how vain they were. And so he was so provocative in challenging them and trying to point out their vanities that they were incredulous that he would have the nerve to do this. Now remember, vanity has a life of its own. We can get kind of high on our delusions of grandeur, and we find friends and subjects that feed that. And vanity is a daughter, so to speak, is an offshoot, is a consequence of pride. And so these are very prideful people striving to be God without God. And he really was a fly in their ointment. He was so insistent on calling them and making them accountable to the church and to the people of God that they exiled him. And what's interesting, they exiled him, and shortly after his exile, there was a huge earthquake in Constantinople, and the empress, she was one of the people he was gunning for, was shaken, no pun intended, and saw this as an act of God, and partially repented and called him back. But he came back, and there wasn't any kind of rapprochement, because they didn't really change. They just didn't want their lives to end, I guess. And so he kept preaching against them again. And then again, later on, he was exiled again, which for a Roman citizen of that time was what a Roman citizen would be punished with instead of being punished with death. They would be sent into exile, because when you're sent into exile for a Roman citizen, that is a fate worse than death, because you are no longer related to the community. So when you think about that, that's a pretty uncanny punishment. And yes, he died the second time around with a cloud of mystery around that death. And so when people are vain, when we are vain, and if we are not supple and humble enough to look at our own character defects, that then the vanity takes on a life of its own to the point of delusion, where we are God and anyone else isn't.
Do you think that in the life of the saints, when we find lots of lamentation, we can bring the Gregory of Narek example because he has a classical collection of lamentations, is the fight against vanity? Because they try to concentrate on their sins rather than on their values.
Well, I have loved St. Gregory of Narek even before I met you, but I'd only read parts of his Lamentations. And the translation translated his book, the title Lamentations, to Speaking to God from the Depths of the Heart. I would say that that's a better translation for Lamentations, because these are like psalms. These are, as the introduction of the book says, it is a kind of psalms for Christians in a way where, starting from the beginning of the book through the end of the book, it is as if you're entering a liturgy from the beginning, and by praying the psalms or reading the psalms meditatively from the beginning through the end, you, in a sense, walk through or celebrate or experience a kind of liturgy through the book, and his life through the book. He was only 50 when he wrote the book, and he was dying of cancer when he wrote the book, and he wrote it in prayer. What an incredible witness. But getting back to your question about vanity, I think that that's one of the consequences of the book, but not the only. He didn't write it against vanity, because the book was, vanity was this big, this very little, very small, 2%, and 98% was about the love of God and surrendering to the love of God. And how can I grow closer to you when I come and my wedding garments, meaning my soul, are dirty with my own distractions, with my own vanity, with my own self-centeredness, with my own wanting things my way and seeking the gifts of the giver, not the giver of the gifts. That he said that phrase. My husband used to say that phrase to me when he was courting me about loving the giver of the gifts. I had no idea where it came from till I learned later on, 25 years later, he was quoting St. Gregory of Narek to me as he was courting me. But vanity is just a small piece of that. And so when vanity takes on a life of its own, we are so missing out on the riches of life. We are so missing out on being embodied in a healthy way and living in a healthy way, connected to our own selves in the presence of God and one another, God himself, as well as creation. Because vanity, among other things, but vanity especially, you said a quote about it, how the word I would use is blocks love. does not allow us to be open to the mercy of God. We can't feel genuine mercy in our own hearts for our own selves, or be open to God's mercy when we're too busy chasing that God with a small g.
As a human being, I think what I understand is, are in search of values all our life. When we are young, we search for better education, being a rich person when we grow up, and things like this. There are things that we're constantly worried about our future to be worthwhile, so that at the end of our life, when we look back, we say, well, we lived a good life. And I have met many people who had been wealthy or whatever, that they were satisfied with their life, and they said that they're happy with it. And some people who were not happy with their life, what they have done during their lives. The question I have is, vanity can prevent our relationship with God and gaining of values, of real values that are not vain.
Yes and no, if I can add. Because there are two types of vanity. There's sort of the physical, of the body vanity, and we said this a little bit in the earlier episode, of appearance, physical strength, even success in the world, how we look in the world to others, even our academic successes, our intelligence. I could even put that under the body, what people can see rather easily in our day-to-day lives. There's that kind of vanity that we can cultivate, and they take on a life of their own to the point where we're no longer sharing, no longer able to share what some of these good gifts that we've been given are for us, because they've taken on such a life of their own. And then there's the other kind of vanity that is of the soul, where any spiritual virtues, gifts that God has given us, any kind of spiritual abilities God may have given us, psychological abilities, let's even say, and skills that are more intuitive or more subtle, but can still be very powerful. We can become very proud of those, we can become very vain with those, and wind up having a love affair with our own gifts, which is, I think, the essence of vanity, that cuts us off from falling in love with the author of those gifts and one another. It's treacherous. And so what is healthy self-care? If I get up in the morning and I wash my face and I brush out my hair and I put on a little lip gloss or a little blush so that I feel that I can meet the world with self-respect, in my particular context where I live and work, is one thing. If it takes on a life of its own, where it cuts me off from life with others whom I love and whom I'm called to serve and love, then vanity blocks love. But we don't feel it because it doesn't hurt.
Because we don't have relationship with God, that can also lead us to gaining other values that, according to Solomon, are vanity. In his life, he tried everything. He gained everything possible, the biggest kingdom, the biggest palace, the biggest temple, all these things he built around himself. And then he realized it's all empty. It doesn't satisfy him. Now, one thing can happen is that because we are a vain person, or we are attracted to values that don't mean anything, we keep going in the wrong direction. But the other thing can happen is that because we don't have a relationship with God, and we are still looking naturally for values because we are created in His image and we're looking for that image, we find that image in other things different than God. And we come to the same result that Solomon came at least at the end of our life, saying that when we look back, there is nothing except our youth that we want to cling to.
Well, it sounds like we need to examine that passage maybe at some other time together, that toward the end, Solomon did wake up to realize what he lost. So the story ends well, and the story is a lesson for all of us, that all of us can be like Solomon, that very subtly we can start out great, as did Solomon, but very subtly we can lose our target, right? And when that happens, our trajectory, just 1 degree at a time, we wind up at a very different port than where we really wanted to begin heading out toward. So thankfully, Solomon woke up toward the end, everything is vanity. It's a wake-up call for us. But we don't have to panic. The second we catch our hearts getting soft, the second we find ourselves feeling shaky regarding our own priorities, That's a gift from God. That's God kind of quivering with us inside our own depths or around us, inviting us to take a breath and look around. And sometimes just looking around the room we're in, we might be caught by something we'd never noticed before. Our own child, a pet, our spouse, a plant, a flower, to bring us back to life, to bring us back to that which matters, that the riches are there oftentimes standing on our own feet. We've been out, like Dorothy, out chasing, going down this yellow brick road when on our own feet we were wearing the ruby slippers that could have us be wherever we needed to be in that moment. It's even easier than that. We just look around. If we happen to be in a situation where there's a lot of pain or there's abuse, then look around to the next block where we can find some relief, some kind of respite. Because the soul knows, at least even if it means one small step at a time, what it needs next. And that's all we need to know, is what we need next. We don't know it's 5 steps down the pike, but we may know that the next step is to turn our hearts in a direction Godward, where we are met with a deeper, perhaps simpler engagement with reality that we've been ignoring all along.
I would like to speak about the scandalous news that I come across all the time because I work in a retail business and those magazines are everywhere. And it catches my eye that so-and-so, a Hollywood star, was caught in a traffic violation or overdose or being out under influence of alcohol. And it kind of, at this moment, reminds me of the situation of Solomon, although I don't want to compare. Solomon was called the wise Solomon, and he has given 2 or 3 books of the Bible for us. But he had reached the highest possible level in the society. He was the richest king in his time. And we have these Hollywood stars that are, in our culture, are considered the richest people. And yet we see that they are wandering around and looking for more satisfaction. And that satisfaction, the search of satisfaction, brings them down to the bottom. What do you think about this? What kind of vanity, or is this a defeat of human being when they search?
Vanity is part of the equation. Let's take a step back. Vanity is a consequence of, or a daughter, so to speak, of pride. And what's pride? We've said this before many times. It's the desire to be God without God. And so when we live in a culture that's pronouncing freedom from religion more than freedom of religion, big difference.
That's a good term.
I've been saying that for years. I just heard a Republican presidential candidate take my line. I don't know how he found my line, but I've been saying that for, I'd say, decades. But freedom from religion. And so when that happens, we are like empty barrels, kind of like, rolling around making our own noise and trying to find our own light and going by our own light or others whose lights look at least as good, if not better than ours, and we mistake that for God. And then we all wind up, going off a cliff together. When we read these headlines, the people going off a cliff together making lots of noise because there's nothing inside. And they're panicking, and they keep reaching for the wrong thing. And so I'm not saying they should come to my little church up in Manchester, New Hampshire. I'm not saying they should come to any specific Christian parish this moment. But I am saying take a look at yourself in the presence of God and reach out and see.
The reason I wanted to speak about this because they are the model for the...
Right, celebrity has become the new saint, so to speak, of our society. And I'm praying people see the example that they are setting. But what's happening is we're being fed, if I may add, we are being fed a whole crock of lots of not good things. And so when somehow the media is tired, or the manipulators of the media are tired of this particular celebrity making a fool of him or herself, they'll go to the next one. Because there's a myriad of people wanting to be in line to be in the limelight, which in itself feeds vanity and pride and a grotesque understanding of what it means to be human. And so we need to take a step back. What does it mean to be human? It's not to be defined by how they define what is healthy, what is the right weight, what is the right look. I'm not saying don't comport ourselves with dignity. That's important. But to take a step back and to talk to others who are not necessarily buying into the gods that are ruling the media and our society, our materialistic society today.
Sometimes even they set an example of going off the cliff. Because so-and-so went off the cliff, I'm going to go too. Because sometimes also they realize that they cannot draw attention anymore, and something they have to do to draw attention.
It's very sad. When we do that, it means parts of ourselves are so deadened that whatever is left or whatever has been growing is like a deformation of the person. And so, or a caricature of what it means to be human. And so we're flying on fewer thrusters, and those thrusters themselves are contaminated. And so only God can heal that. You know, all of us are cracked pots. I'm now changing my metaphors left and right all along. But only God can heal all of us. And so to take a step back, just to admit, I'm not God and God is God. When Jesus sent out the apostles, he sent them out 2 by 2, and when you would send your peace would stay the house that you were visiting. If it was worthy, if not, it would go back to you. And what came up in our conversation is, like an infection. If the gospel is like a good infection, is the household ready? Are their hearts receptive to being infected by the love of God? And if they're not, because they're too haughty or they're too hard because they don't want to acknowledge anything bigger than themselves, then that blessing, that peace will bounce back. Well, that's pretty much what happens. Vanity is also part of that mix. In a previous episode, we brought up Sodom and Gomorrah, and about Lot's wife, who was changed to salt because she had regrets of the bad old days, the good old bad old days. And when we were talking together, what came up was she might have been getting hard on the inside for a long time before that last call saying, "Don't look back or you'll turn to salt," because she was with Lot the whole time God was speaking to him, and it didn't faze her. It didn't faze her that this was going to happen, and she was still, that's sort of the insight that came up for me, at least, in our conversation, that she was turning into a pillar of salt for a long, long time before it finally happened that day when she looked back for the last time. She was stuck on Sodom and Gomorrah. But Sodom and Gomorrah, two entities, two populations of people who were, in a sense, living in a closed circuit life of debauchery and vanity, getting off on their understanding of beauty and competing for it, so that, like a dog chasing its own tail, there was no way for love to come in. And so that's what vanity does to all of us.
And actually, I have been thinking about this story lately, and what I thought about it is the reason that Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed by God is because they refused. Basically, theologically, the Holy Trinity was visiting them.
Vanity casts a spell. Vanity, we talk about this in our addictions class for addictions, but there's a kind of romance that goes on with any addiction. And vanity itself has false promises that cast a spell, that make us chase the spell, make us chase whatever that false promise is. And there's a kind of romance that goes on with what it could give us. And then, it doesn't follow through, so a new promise, a new advertisement hits us, a new enticement comes our way, where, no, try this one and you'll get what you want. There's a spell, there's a romance that keeps feeding this God that leads us away from the real God. It's a wake-up call for all of us every day, just to be peacefully aware of this. Mm-hmm. Self-care is good. Vanity is not.
There's a folk expression. It says that we are not going to take anything from this life but our coffin. People realize this.
That's really wonderful, that at least in Armenia, growing up where you were, relatively modern times, before the fall of communism, after the fall of communism, even if people were not believers, that they were acknowledging death, that, all we can take with us are the 4 planks. And what I was thinking when you said that, but they carry us in it, we don't take it, there's a kind of humility. Our finiteness does remind us of our humility, that we are finite bits of clay created in the image and likeness of God. And so that's pretty great that a lot of people were kind of walking in a way that was receptive to a lot of God's precepts because they were in touch with acknowledging that we are finite and we're going to die. Come to this country, we live in a society where we are, by and large, promoting a caricature of life in a consumeristic way. And so the more we consume, the more life, quote unquote, we will have, and a death-denying, illness-denying, limitations-denying culture that is, again, leading us astray.
When we were speaking about the shame of getting old, one of the students said, all our life, when we were very young, we strive to be independent. And then by the time that we're going independent more and more, we're going up the scale. And finally, when we reach that point where we feel like we're independent, we stay there a very short time, and then we start declining because we're getting old. Now we start feeling that we're losing that, what we have been trying. So that's also vanity, I think, that we strive for the wrong thing. Dependent or independent from what?
I'll tell you a story, and I've not remembered it till recently, and this is just the second time, maybe a third time that I remembered this story. But I was 6 or 7 years old, talking with my grandmother, my yaya, after whom I'm named. Her name is Kiriaki. And I don't know where we were, but I know I wasn't more than 6, maybe 7, I think 6. And she'd say to me, oh, I can see you growing, megalones.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yes, yeah, I'm growing, megalono. And then she said, ke ego megalono. And she said the same word in Greek. I too am growing up. But to say in Greek, megalono, megalones, for a child it means growing up.
Mm-hmm.
For an older person it means growing old. And when she said it to me, it must have been just before I was 7, just before when the brain can really start doing abstract reasoning, but I was starting to get some kind of abstract reasoning. I was horrified that she was using, and she was enjoying it, the same word, megalono for herself, and megalono for me, the little girl. Because she, with that same word, was pointing to that same phenomenon you were talking about, the same process of growing and growing.
Growing up and growing down.
Growing up and growing down. And she's scared that was the first time, I think, when I felt the fear of aging and death was at age 6, when my grandmother said, ke ego megalono.
Yes, that's very interesting. I have heard an expression that the smart people, when they go for a journey, they prepare for going, and the wise people prepare for coming back. When we're very young, we have to have this thought of growing down, growing older.
You'll read writings from the spiritual tradition that talk about persons who have been given the gift of long life and reasonable health, that their eyesight may fade, their hearing may grow dull, their energy level may lessen, and even their short-term memory is not what it used to be. And what the moral of the story is, God is encouraging us to look within, that the body slows down so that you can become more attached to the giver of life, when you might have been in earlier years more distracted by the priorities of living. And that's not a bad thing.
When I read The Shame of Getting Old, I kind of associated these two things, that a friend of mine who's my age is already noticing that his sight is not as good as he was when he was younger, and maybe he's feeling like he hasn't accomplished anything in life and he now is getting old. What is he going to do? And maybe that's where the shame comes, when people don't have anything to claim for their lives.
Well, even if we were Solomon, there's going to be shame, because we wind up confronting our finiteness if we're lucky, if we're blessed to do that. So if we're Solomon, or if we're just another Joe on the bus, we're going to be confronting our finiteness if we're lucky, if we're blessed to do this. And that's an opportunity to reach out toward the author of life. And it's hard, and it's easy to be distracted from one minute to the next. And so I think the effort of turning Godwards pleases God.
Recently I heard this expression that has to do with Anthony Bloom. Somebody was doing a presentation on iconography. He's a very good iconographer, and he presented what icons are and what the images and art in general is. He said at the end of his life, when he was dying in a hospital, he called this priest who was taking care of him, and they were talking, and then he says, "I'm really sad that I'm dying." And the priest said, "Why? You're old and you have done so much." And he said, "No, I haven't done anything. I just started becoming Christian. And I'm dying now. I don't have time to become Christian." That was a great lesson. And that the priest who was doing the presentation, the iconographer who was doing the presentation, he says, "To me, this person is a saint." Now he's saying that he has just started becoming Christian when he was in his deathbed. And
that's encouraging. That's
yes.
encouraging to all of us, because we may not be like Solomon. We may not wind up having the gifts, the spiritual gifts and opportunities and responsibilities that Metropolitan Anthony Bloom had. But the way you're sharing his final days with us reminds us that it's the turning toward God. At the Easter Vigil for the Orthodox, there is a beautiful sermon that is read at the end of the liturgy that was written originally by St. John Chrysostom. And he talks about everybody is welcome to the feast. Everyone is welcome to the banquet, those who come. Those who came at the beginning, those who came at the 6th hour, those who came at the 10th hour, those who came at the 11th hour. Everyone is welcomed with equal joy and equal reception. And so this is, again, all about the banquet. It's all about our being in the presence of God for real, completely. No questions about it like we do on this side of the line. And so if the wake-up call is at the 11th hour, that's okay. It's not a bad thing.
Yes, and that's very encouraging, because those people who get old and they have lived their lives in vanity, which means emptiness, and now they are panicking because they see that they're going to end up in a nursing home and die one day, and nobody's even going to notice that they existed. It's not late for them to go after the real values and give the meaning to their lives and become a saint in 2 days or 2 years or whatever is remaining from their lives. And that's what the real values are. And so there is hope for everybody, everywhere, at any time, at any age. And vanity will dissolve once God enters into the space.
That's right. We get something better.
Mm-hmm.
It's like we're polishing a little thing here. Meanwhile, we've got the whole universe here that is waiting for us.
But in the same time, it's very difficult. It's very difficult. I really want to share that, actually. The image that a vanity is presented as a woman sitting on a couch, a beautiful woman, holding a mirror, and we condemn that vanity. We kind of criticize it. At the same time, one of the interpreters of this image says that deep in our heart, in secret, we desire that state of existence. We want to be like her, and we desire even her. And when I was talking about the celebrities, how they hit their bottom of their lives and they crush and they destroy everything, and even in that level that they are desired, people who are in poverty, they say, well, at least they can freely do that. Recently, the story of Michael Jackson was very popular. People were crying when he died and destroyed his life. But yet, he was a very desired person. One thing I would like to talk, we have a very short time, is Christ talking to the Pharisees, I think, and saying that when you are fasting, don't pretend like you're doing something. But anoint your heads with oil and show out to the people like you were not doing anything. It's just like a normal day for you. What would you say about this? It's like Christ suggesting vanity.
That's a good point, that vanity would be for people to, the false humility. See, we can be falsely humble, and that be an expression of vanity. That false humility is an expression of that spiritual vanity. Mm-hmm. So if we look like we're fasting, or we look like we're doing wonderful feats of spiritual self-care or holiness, then we get our reward. That's what Jesus would often say. They already have their reward.
Yes.
Your Father who sees in secret, sees what you're doing in secret or not doing in secret. And so the relationship we have with God bottom line is a private one. You know, yours with God, mine with God, everybody's with God. And so what does Jesus say? Pray in your closet first. It is good for 2 or 3 to gather in God's name, and that's good too. But when you want to really pray, find your closet, go in and lock the door, and seek your Father who is in heaven. That is very private. And so by anointing our bodies or our faces, as the scripture says, when we fast, when we strive to gauge God with our mind and heart and our bodies, realigning ourselves.
John of Audun, who went to meet the king in his best vestments, I guess he was fasting all his life, having those goat skins on his bare body.
It's private.
Which was private.
It's all private.
Very
That's where I was
privately,
going.
he was fasting,
It's the same
and
thing.
he didn't want to show off to the king how he's fasting.
It's part of the same thing.
Mhm.
That you disguise, you distract people. They should not know the depths that you are going to be in the presence of God on your side of the line. And so when we anoint our bodies, our faces, and we put on a little bit of an act that we have more energy than we're really feeling because we've been fasting, that God's pleased with that because He wants each one of us fully to Himself. And that, and the two connect. Thank you, Akali.
This is wonderful. I think we came to a last conclusion here. One is that our relationship with God that dissolves vanity is private, and we don't have to show it to avoid the spiritual vanity, and also we don't have to put our interests into other people's lives because it's also their private life. All we can say is about vanity in general. We don't have to judge anybody and desire them at the same time. And we have to humbly and privately keep ourselves away from vanity. Thank you very much. This was awesome, wonderful. And we'll meet next time. We'll continue our conversations. And I'm very grateful. Dear audience, thank you for your attention. And we'll see you next time. Have a good day.